Welcome to Discerning Faith Podcast. I am Daryl.
I am Nathan.
And last week we kind of started our walk through the books of the Bible, kind of a somewhat high-level overview, maybe a little more in-depth than some would have done, but just trying to kind of give you guys an idea of what each book has to offer, what it's about, main themes, and maybe some key verses and everything. And so we went through all of Genesis. That's all we got through. We weren't sure how long it would take us with each book, so this may be a 10 episode or it could be only 3 or 4. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But so we started with Genesis and kind of talked about some of the themes there. Do we want to do a recap, you think?
Yeah, sure. We can go over some.
Just do a big
sure
quick.
things.
Yep. So, of course, in the beginning, God.
Yep.
So it's all about the main character, God. Man was made in God's image.
So we are still important as well. We have purpose.
But we're not the main characters. So don't get main character syndrome. We also were given purpose by God. Work is a good thing, whether we like it or not.
Yep.
Gives us purpose. The fall, pattern of rebellion.
This world is messed up and we are messed up. We're no different.
Yep. Speaking of being messed up and dysfunctional and broken families, if you have one, so does everybody else. And then we talked about, of course, God calling out Israel as his chosen people and just their story as it got started.
God being a blessing through those who are obedient to him.
So that brings us kind of on to Exodus. And so at the end of Genesis, we left the Israelites in Egypt, but with favor. And God had kind of carved out a little spot for them there through Joseph. But in Exodus, there grew a Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph. Well, that's always hit me as a very key transition in phrase. It's really just kind of puts into perspective what's going on. I just think it's good.
He forgot Joseph, and because Joseph was being faithful to God and God was working through him, essentially they also forgot God's work for Egypt as well. So
yeah, because I mean, Joseph's work saved Egypt alongside, first and foremost before he even did anything with it.
Yep.
Absolutely. So you want to get into Exodus?
Yeah, so Israel grows to become a nation, but that king forgot what Joseph had done, and it's like, okay, what are we going to do with these people? We're going to deal shrewdly with them, and they're going to be our workers, our slaves, and we're going to be over them.
So he takes a family of probably 20 or 30 to, I think the estimates I've heard is literally close to 1 million.
70 enter Egypt.
Is it 70 then?
Yeah, 70 or 77, depending on who's being counted and where along the journey that they're... That's one thing. Some people, the Bible's inconsistent. It lists a couple different numbers for how many are going into Egypt, but it depends on where you are along the way, who all makes it, and sometimes who's being counted, because not every time everyone's being counted.
Yeah, because part of it is you don't always count women, children.
Right.
It's just the men and stuff. So
and other times you do.
So it was 70, but still, I think I've heard estimates that it was close to 1 million or maybe even 5 million. I've heard a couple different estimates.
It also depends on, for the millions part, depends on if you're just counting the Israelites or if you're also counting, because, spoiler alert, they're eventually going to leave Egypt, but...
What?
I know. They also leave with some of the other slaves that are there, and so it depends on, are you including some of these outside nations who also cause some problems for the people of Israel as they're wondering about.
Do we know what nations they become or anything?
No. It's never quite listed where they came from, just that they were other people that the Egyptians got essentially as workers and slaves, and so the other nations like, hey, if they're leaving, we're tagging along. But we want to do things our way.
So God brings up Moses, who was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. Is that right?
Yep.
And it's, I know we kind of, in our notes, we're going to go just right past that, but I think it's really a cool story of, well, first of all, there's a theme that you find of those who don't want to follow the Lord and who are hostile to the Lord. They like to kill babies. So, the Israelites are growing in number, and Pharaoh kind of goes, this might become a problem. If they rebel, they have more numbers than we do. This is bad.
Kill the sons, spare the daughters.
Yeah. Which is interesting because obviously because they're more likely to fight well, but also they probably would be the better workers for at least big manual labor. But anyway, so, but of course the Hebrew midwives were God-fearing, and they're like, well, they kind of come up with a lie to cover up that they're trying to protect the babies. But Moses' mom is a God-fearing and is like, well, I'm not going to let them kill my baby. And so, but she says, Lord, I'm just going to put him in a reed basket, make him safe as well as I can for the moment, send him down the river. And of course, in God's providence, he brings him to the palace or however that worked out. And so brings up Moses. He grows up in Egyptian culture, which I think we kind of can gloss over that, but I think there was a reason for that. God prepared him for what he was going to do.
But he was also still connected to his Hebrew brethren because he goes out and he's like, okay, I'm going to see the plight of who I am. He knows he's still Hebrew and not truly an Egyptian.
Right.
And so he sees their plight and ends up killing a guy who's beating one of the Hebrews. I think we lose a little bit of that, but the Hebrew there is like the guy is like beating him severely, like within an inch of his life sort of a thing. And so he defends the man who's being wrongly beaten. However, that gets hurt and he has to flee for his own life here. And he goes wandering about outside of the nation for, I think it's 40 years is what's listed there before God calls him back to, okay, you are the one who's going to be the leader here. As Moses was looking to be from the beginning, as again, he was looking after the plight of his brethren. So,
well, and he was probably about 40 years before he ever even left, 40 years old before he even left Egypt. So, we were talking about while we were preparing the Prince of Egypt movie, and it's actually fairly reasonably pretty good. But you see Moses is probably closer to a 40-year-old man rather than an 80-year-old man.
No, this dude's already too old to be doing this job.
Yes. And of course Moses, when God comes to him in the burning bush, was like, "Yeah, cool, God, I'm going to do that." No, he's pretty reluctant.
Can you pick anyone else other than me? I'm old.
I stutter. Okay, it's never been a problem for you before.
And here's your brother, so...
There you go. Yeah. So he sends Moses and Aaron back to Egypt to deal with that. And, of course, we know about the 10 plagues. So we won't go into those in real detail, other than I watched a documentary that I thought was really interesting. I don't remember if it was from a Christian perspective or not. I want to lean towards it was it. But it talks about how there is somewhat of a scientific, potentially... scientific explanation for some of the, if not all of them, and how the way that they come are actually logical with, like, if this happens, then the next one come logically, scientifically after that. So, like, for instance, the blood of the water could have been a red algae bloom that kills everything and makes it inhospitable, which then leads to the frogs coming out and so on and so forth. Obviously, there's a few of them that are very, clearly God's hand.
Where'd the sun go?
Yeah. Although it could have been an eclipse, but that would have been a long eclipse. Anyway, I bring that up just because something I've wrestled with is you find kind of, there's a ditch on both sides of the room again. When you talk to Christians about these kind of things, miracles and stuff, there's the ones that say, well, there's no explanation for it. Only God could do it. And therefore it's miraculous. And if you were to ever suggest that's anything other than that there's something to do scientifically that God used, well, then you just don't trust in the Lord enough. Or there's those who say God doesn't work miraculously.
We can explain everything through science.
Neither one of those are a good balance. God created the world, the way that the systems of the world, the way things work. So if God works a miracle, we'll put it in quotes for this reason, miracle through something of science, it's still a miracle and God still did it. God is still sovereign.
Yes.
If God does something that's outside of the nature of nature.
Yes.
Outside the normal processes or processes, I guess is the way to say that now. The processes of nature, it's still God being sovereign because he created those processes anyway. But also, I just think we can make it either way over spiritualized or way under spiritualized.
Yes.
And so I think the plagues are a good way to do that, and to be honest, it doesn't change to me whether God completely just kind of pushed the things of them and then they just kind of came naturally, because God's very clear that if Pharaoh were to repent, he would have stopped the plagues. So either way, there's something miraculous going on there.
Yes.
Or if it was completely, there's no logical explanation. God is still God. He's still on the throne. He is still sovereign.
Yes.
And so I just think that's a good point to kind of pull out there.
Yeah. So it's several chapters of plagues, fun times for everyone involved. Not really.
And the Israelites get spared later.
Yes. Speaking of which, they eventually, after the death of the firstborn, which again, God forewarned Moses of beforehand, and Moses was supposed to forewarn the Pharaoh of beforehand. Moses didn't, but anyway, the Egyptians let the Israelites and all these other nations we talk about go, and along the way, the Israelites ask, "Hey, can you give us goods as we're leaving?" And they plunder the Egyptians, as is said, and they leave out with a lot of Egypt's wealth.
Mhm.
And Egypt's like, "Wait a minute. This is a bad idea. Where'd all our slaves go? We need them back." They try to go get them. Then, the crossing of the Red Sea, and a lot of people tried swimming with horses, which don't work very well. So, yes. So, after all those miracles and everything, and God revealing himself directly and so powerfully, everyone just followed him completely, wholly, faithfully for the rest of the time, never complained about anything. The end.
Kind of like how we say, if you just show yourself to me, yeah, no, that's not what happens.
Yeah. No,
so, within literally almost no time, they're like, well, there were leeks and onions, which is probably just straight up a lie. There's no way that they were fed well. We had all this in Egypt. We should just go back to Egypt.
I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. What have you done for me in the last 5 minutes, God?
Right. And so God brings manna and then quail. And even then, they don't even follow the instructions there, which, again, we're not to be too harsh on the Israelites, because I would have probably been just as bad.
Yes.
I know I like to complain when, my food's cold or something stupid.
We can very easily fall into the same attitudes ourselves.
Yeah. So, it's continuing that legacy of rebellion we saw in Genesis. So, selfishness, and again, we're not immune to those attitudes. So, yeah. So, I'll let you kind of take the next one.
Yep. So God begins to establish the law, which is a blessing for all people, particularly his people. But even then, it's supposed to be an example that the rest of the world sees, as it talks about in the promise to Abraham that everyone else is blessed through as well. Okay. The ones we tend to associate with in Exodus are, he gives the 10 Commandments, and yes, those as well, but there is a lot of the law that begins to be established in Exodus, not just anything super. It's not just some short little section like, okay, here's a few laws. Like, there's quite a few laws he gives beginning in Exodus, and then it continues to build upon and expound more and more in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as well. God doesn't just front load them all at once and say, here's the entire thing. He gives them a little bit piece at a time. Again, it's how God tends to reveal himself, is with pieces at a time. So it begins that here in Exodus with the law in particular.
So, I don't know where we're going after that, so I'll let you. Any other thoughts you had there? Sorry.
No. So after the law, there's a pretty long section. It probably is jarring to many people, because it is a long time spent on the design and the construction of the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle as well. And it's one I think a lot of people, and myself included, can easily, especially first times reading over it, gloss over and like,
this many candlesticks. Yes. Make sure it's from this type of horse or not, but this animal hide.
Some of it like porpoises or something like that. And so, what does any of this have to do with anything? This is kind of weird. But we see from this in the law, we see that God has particular ways he desires to be worshipped. It's not about however we feel like worshiping him or following him. Any way is good there. No, God has, and I know this will probably grind some gears for some Christians out there, but God has particular ways he wants to be worshipped, and in a lot of ways that, no, do not. You follow me the way I want to be followed, because I am king. As we talked about, he is the main character here. He determines these things. He determines the rules. He has his own characteristics. He has his own preferences. He has his own personality. I think sometimes we can de-emphasize that a lot with God. It's like, he's just this impersonal force. So anything really goes with an impersonal force. Even in Christianity, we can often treat him as such. It's like, no, God has particulars because he is a person. He has 3 persons. But
I think this is our typical discerning faith. Let's kind of dog on the American culture. But I actually don't see this as more of a dogging, as just the reality of we don't have kings anymore. And you would approach the king the way the king tells you to approach him.
Yes.
And we lose that in ours because we're very informal society.
Six Emperor Tyrannus.
But at the same time, something that would be a good parallel for us now is you don't go to a courtroom, especially if you're the one on trial
Mhm.
in your shorts and sandals,
Mhm.
right? You present yourself the best you can, or else the judge is going to say, "Get out of my court."
Right.
You know, there is still times when you have to approach things correctly in a certain way.
Mhm.
If you get stopped by an officer of the law, you don't start being belligerent and badgering him, or else it will probably go poorly for you.
I mean, we do it in this society, but it goes poorly for us. So.
Exactly. You know, whereas I was taught that you give respect to the officer and he'll give respect back. And I've always had pretty good luck with that.
Mhm.
When I have been pulled over, now it's been years since I've been pulled over, surprisingly. But anyway, so yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the big purposes of the whole Ark of the Covenant thing that we miss out on is God does have particulars in how he wants to be worshipped, and there's some other messages you draw from that. You know, God is a God of beauty, and so a lot of these things are ornate, and it's more aside. We don't have notes on this, but we'll go off on a little bit of a tangent. I think in particular in the modern American church, we can really look down upon these grand cathedrals of old and the beauty of them. It's like, oh, that's so superfluous. Why are we doing that? We could have spent money on something else. Or as long as it's practical, why does it matter? It doesn't matter to God. Except if you read the description of how we're building the ark, how we're doing the tabernacle.
Or the temple.
Yeah, the temple, and we eventually get to that. Like, there are many, many chapters on how intricate and how beautiful and how designed these things are, because such things can bring us into a particular mindset.
State of reverence.
Yes, a state of reverence for God. Can we also accidentally worship such things and kind of do idolatry with such? Yes. But considering God commanded these things to be built, I think that's a risk that God was willing to take. So
I pretty much agree, but I just want to throw a devil's advocate out because I think it's good for discussion. Could that have changed with the new covenant? Is there anything that could have changed? Because the reason I asked this,
yes,
I'm reading in the prophets still. I'm almost finished. I'm in Zechariah. No, what's the one before Zechariah? I am in a Zechariah, but I'm reading more than one. But it's a two chapter one. Haggai, yes. And Haggai, he basically, the two chapters are, why are you guys living in houses while I don't have a temple to dwell in?
Yes.
And I'm sitting there going, why does God care about this? And I'm still trying to wrestle with that. So maybe you can help me out here. But God, God says I don't dwell in,
right,
something built by human hands. So what is the significance there? Is it because of the Holy of Holies then, and that was where they went? Was it because
I think part of it may be that they were honoring themselves over God as well, and like, okay, we're just going to take care of our own business first and foremost. And so, not only is it a way for us to get reverence for, in our relationship with God, but it's also a way to honor Him as well. When David asked,
wasn't it a command to have a temple?
Yes,
for them to make the temple.
Yeah, and he says even in before Solomon builds the temple, like, this is something that's going to be done eventually. Where I tell you to put down, and where I tell you my city will be, and where my temple will be, it's already foreordained. And when David offers and asks God, hey, I will build you a temple, and Nathan says, oh yeah, go do that first, and then double checks with God, and God's like, nope, it's not going to be David, it's going to be his son. God's not like grossly offended by David's offer. He says, it's not you though. It's
not your place.
Yes.
I have chosen someone else.
Yes, but the idea of it itself, God's not off put by.
So back to my original question, do you think it could be a difference in the Old and New Covenant, possibly? Is there anything?
I don't see anything in the New Testament that would contradict that God has changed his mind on. That would be my biggest thing. Like, there's nothing explicitly in the New Testament, hey, go build another new temple or anything, because essentially God's going to bring down the new temple in the new Jerusalem.
Well, and when Jesus dies on the cross, the Holy of Holies is the veil is torn.
Yes.
So it's as if God is now dwelling with us. That's kind of the significance of it.
But I still think the honor and reverence is not lost in the New Testament at the same point. If someone's trying to build a cathedral, it's like, oh, this is going to be the New Jerusalem. I think you missed the point at that point, because God's
Sure.
going to bring about that. But I still think that there can be a awe and a reverence that comes from that. Like, it's kind of related. It's a parallel. It's not directly related, but I've never been there. But the Ark Museum, from what I understand, a lot of people say it brings a certain awe and reverence for
Absolutely.
God's work in the flood
Yep.
through this kind of replica here. And so these vast, masterful, in this case, a recreation, can still really bring a new depth and appreciation for God
Sure.
through all this work. So
That's fair.
there's nothing in the New Testament that says really you stop doing that or that you keep doing that, one way or the other. Is the
silent.
biblical answer as best I can give. But I think that the principle can still continue and apply.
Sure.
Just
Sure.
don't go overboard and start idolizing it either.
Or kind of like St. Peter's Basilica. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of it. It is ornate beyond working.
Yes.
And it's kind of like at some point, is there we're going too far that way too.
Is this being done in our own pride or what exactly?
Yeah. And especially with the way we know that the St. Peter's Basilica was paid for.
Yeah.
With things like, indulgences.
Yes.
But anyway.
But like, think of recent examples like when Notre Dame caught fire and whatnot, and they were rebuilding, and some Christians were uppity about that. It's like, no, rebuild Notre Dame. That's fine. That's a heritage for us first and foremost, but it is also throughout the centuries has brought people into a deeper appreciation. So let's honor that. And so one kind of final point with the Ark of the Covenant is that it's a community effort. People are bringing in their offerings and their gatherings and whatnot for the actual resources that they need to build the Ark, and they do this for the temple as well. It's a community effort. There are leaders who are overseeing it and are called by God to oversee it and guide it, but it is a community effort at the same time, which is also kind of a picture for how we still operate as a church, where this is a community effort. We do still have called leaders who we are under the guidance of, but this isn't just we leave everything to them, or, well, I'm leader in name, essentially. I have no authority, and it's it's just a democracy. Leave everything to everyone. That's not how it works either. So it's both a community effort, but also under the guidance and leadership of individuals. So
Absolutely.
So you want to go into the key verse we kind of pulled out as kind of a summary of what all happened here.
So key verse for Exodus we pulled out was 2:23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. The cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.
Mm-hmm. So again, this is a continuation of the promise that we talked about in Genesis as well. This is continuing the work and the plan that God had set in motion.
And specifically in his chosen people.
So that was kind of why we brought up that key verse. It shows the continued faithfulness of God to his plan, to his people, which eventually was a blessing to us as well. So even this day.
So now we'll get into everybody's favorite book, of course, right? So Leviticus.
Ironically, I think people would probably enjoy this one more than Numbers or Deuteronomy.
That's fair. But so Leviticus, there's 5 main offerings that are talked about. That's where it starts, with the burnt offering, the grain offering, peace offering, sin offering, and trespass. So you want to do a brief summary of each?
Yeah. So I think this is a little bit daunting for people. Is like it jumps straight into the sacrifices and offerings here, which I think is what probably turns off most people to Leviticus. So do a very brief summary of what the purpose of each was. The burnt offering is what you made when you knew that you sinned against God. I done goofed. And it's not a crime with a particular punishment. I done goofed, and this calls for a burnt offering of some particular description that I need to make to be brought back into right relationship with God here. The grain offering, I'm kind of going just in order that they're actually listed in the scripture. So the grain offering is what is made essentially out of God's abundance. Here's the harvest, and so we give 1/10 back, and this is kind of a bringing back to God the blessings that he has bestowed upon us, kind of like what we do with our tithe. a very similar thing, but particularly with agriculture and food with their society. So,
Well, and that was part of their income was the food.
yeah, and that's part of what brought up and kept the priest around. We'll get to that here in a little bit, but hey, priests got to eat too. The peace offering is kind of like a community, like, okay, this guy and I made an agreement together, and so we're going to offer this to kind of have God as one overseer of whatever agreement or, celebration that we're participating in right now. So one, God is head over it, but it's also the people who are making the offering actually participated in eating this particular offering, a peace offering. So it was all kind of a celebration time as well. Yeah, it's a little bit more of a happy sacrifice and offering as we think about it. A little bit more thoughts on that here in a minute. The sin offering, which I think in name can confuse us with the burnt offering. Well, it wasn't the burnt offering for sin. The burnt offering is for sins that you knew that you committed and knew that you violated against God. As we talked about, God kind of revealed his law in stages to the people. And so you might mess up without realizing you messed up. And that's what the sin offering is for. Kind of a burnt offering, but for things that you didn't realize you done goofed on at the time. And finally, the trespass offering is like the sin offering, but with people, where it's like, oh, I messed up and hurt this in like some business dealing, or whether, something happened in life and I hurt this guy unintentionally. You make a trespass offering to bring yourself back into a right relationship, essentially with your neighbor, but kind of we're restoring the community through this sacrifice here. As I've kind of hinted at, like, we tend to think of offerings as being only for sins, and quite a few of them are, but not all of them are for sin. As we talked about with the grain and peace offering, some of them are voluntary. They're more about the joy of what's going on in life instead. I think we miss out on that in a lot of our mindset with the American church in general, but probably even maybe in just church in general and Christians in general and across the world these days, where we don't value sacrifice as much. One, because we had the ultimate sacrifice for sin, so we don't even worry about the sacrifices that were made specifically for sin. But we don't want to give up what we have anyway. So, well, we don't need to sacrifice anymore. That's Old Testament stuff.
We're too selfish to want to give up anything.
And it's part of our faith, and it's a joy to us to be able to sacrifice. What were you saying?
I was just going to ask, or I guess state/ask. I wonder if it'd be a good time to kind of go over what was the need for these sacrifices in sin, because we might have some people who don't understand. And even I think Christians who have been in the faith for a long time still struggle with what was this here for? So it's pre-Christ.
Yeah.
So that's a good, important distinction to understand is,
so we don't
not pre-Christ as in he wasn't around, right? Pre-incarnate in his flesh, Christ.
Pre the final sacrifice for sin that came, the final blood sacrifice that came through him. I guess blood sacrifice is part of the reason why, because we don't have the verse here, so whoever's editing will have to pull it up, but the wages of sin is death. And there's essentially always a blood cost to our sin in this life. Ultimately, Christ paid it out for us on the cross, but until that part of God's plan was revealed and finalized, there was a cost that we still had that someone has to pay for this. That sin is not valueless, that there is always some penalty that has to be paid for it. And so this was the essentially way that they did it in the Old Testament, but it was never a perfect final one. You're always going to have to make it again and again and again, because you're still going to screw up again. And eventually, that cost racks up over time. Sorry, starting to, you can jump in while I'm sort of thoughts here. So
yeah, I just think of it as, I think in our society, we don't treat sin as egregious or as with enough gravity that it takes. And so, we don't realize the need for the restoration and for the cost. There is a cost that it incurs when there's a blood cost.
Ironically, that costs us less and more than it should be. Like why are they killing all these animals in particular? Because God is merciful. We only have to sacrifice animals. That something else pays the price for us. It still costs us because we're still stewards over those possessions. But if we're talking about the true cost of sin, it'd be our own blood each time, first and foremost, after the very first sin, right off the bat.
Right.
And so,
but God is merciful.
Yes.
But he is also just.
Yes.
God cannot abide sin. God cannot allow sin to be unpunished because he is a just God.
Yes.
And I think we forget that piece of God sometimes. Or, we tend to be one way or the other. We're either way too worried about that, and especially for others than ourselves.
Yes.
Or we're like, oh, well, God is love. God can be love and just at the same time.
He has to, if he is loving, he has to be just.
Exactly. And, oh no, we already switched over. Sorry. So but God is just and God is love. And so if you're loving, let's say someone wrongs your child, you're not going to sit back, or your wife, or your, any other loved one, that if someone were doing something to them, if you just sat back and like, okay,
I guess that happened. Sorry about your luck, honey.
Yeah. People would be up in arms about that, right? Well, this is literally, you sinned against God himself. Every sin is against God.
It can also be against other people, but everyone's against God.
It will also be, yes, but ultimately they're against God and against God's character and who he is. So if we don't, if God does not bring about justice for that, he cannot be loving. And if he's loving, he also, though, will be merciful and therefore allow a way out from under it, but yet it still be paid for. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, which is where sacrifice comes from.
Yes. And then, of course, the whole plan all along, these sacrifices were pointing to the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus.
Yes.
That was the plan all along. And so these point to that picture of who Christ will be for us when he comes in the flesh.
And he takes on the sins for others. So.
Yes. Yeah. And, it points to, there's a lot of things about the sacrifices that point to Christ. Like it has to be, a spotless lamb. Obviously nothing was perfect because sin had, but yeah. So unblemished, all those things. And it had to be something that was of value. You couldn't just take, and that's part of why the unblemished, because you can get more money for an unblemished, a perfect or a good lamb, as opposed to that sickly one over there.
Yep.
It has to be an actual sacrifice, not only in the fact of you're killing it, but it has to be something that you're going to feel the cost of it. So, yeah. So
about the first 10 chapters go over those offerings and whatnot. And then we get into a lot of the general, what are the duties of the priest? What are responsibilities? What is it for those who are the spiritual leaders of this people? What is expected of them? And we learn pretty quick, again, we can't just do whatever we want in following God, as we kind of talked about before. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, offer a type of incense that essentially God did not command. God had specifically said, you're going to offer this type of incense. Well, this is one we created for you, God, so you're going to enjoy this.
We got creative.
Let me cook, God. You'll nope. Boom, you're dead.
Instantly dead. Well, and I think we lose the impact of that, and we're almost like, well, why is God really just for reacting that way? But God had prescribed these very clearly, exactly how it should be. That's what the first 10 chapters were about. And then as soon as we get to the right here, they're just like, okay, well, I'm going to do my own thing, And I think there's an application in our lives that God wants us to do things, but also do them the correct way.
Yes.
We need to glorify him by doing things the way that he prescribes to us. Now, everything's not prescribed perfectly for us.
Right.
It's not like the Bible. The Bible covers everything that needs to be covered, but it doesn't prescribe every little detail.
As we talked about in Genesis, when we're doing our walk with God, we have general ideas and pictures of what we're supposed to do. If the God specifically tells you in a situation, great, but it's not always going to be, you're not always going to be told what happens in that specific situation. Same thing with worshiping God here and the priestly duties and whatnot. But
it was specifically prescribed exactly how it should be done.
Yes.
And they went against that. So, yeah. It also was to help teach God's law to others, and we think that this is like, a lot of time we think of, oh, well, that's all in this one book, but God progressively reveals more and more of his law and himself to the Israelites as well. So,
he had a duty for both the spiritual well-being of their people, which I think is easy for us to remember for the priests, but there are also a lot of laws on the physical well-being. Hey, if there's leprosy in this area, what do you do? Hey, if this person's sick, what do you do? Hey, if there's some sort of not necessarily sin, but thing that is ritually unclean and we need cleansed from, what do you do? And so there's also physical safeguards that the priests are the ones that got appointed to be leaders over for the people they had authority over. So it's one that's just, I think we can lose out on, but it's like, yeah, it's striking and it's there. So.
Well, and it's kind of cool to see, because we know God's sovereign, God's all knowledgeable, but to see that, like, what God does if someone has leprosy is still what we would do today if we came across that kind of a disease.
Yes.
You quarantine them. You clean everything of where they've ever been to make sure that it doesn't spread. God was teaching them germ theory before germs were ever even a thought on man's mind. But the other thing that's really cool about God's law and these priestly duties that they had to follow is God was setting them apart, making them a holy nation. That's important because that is how God reveals himself, is through the people that follow him. And now we can be good ambassadors for him, or we can be poor ambassadors for him, right? Nate and I were kind of having an off the record conversation about that actually while we were kind of getting ready. We won't get into the details, but when someone knows that you bear the name of Christ, you have a higher responsibility to bear that name well.
Yep.
If someone doesn't, now I'm not saying if someone doesn't know you're a Christian, you should just go live however you want. That's clearly not what I'm saying. But we have a responsibility to be a good ambassador for Christ, and not besmirch his name, not make people look down on him and who God is.
Yeah. And some of those things may require extra burdens. The priests were held to a higher standard, and some of the things like, well, the rest of the people get to enjoy these things, but the priests don't. It doesn't mean what the people were enjoying were necessarily sins, but they, as leaders, had to hold themselves to a higher standard. So they had restrictions on like who they could marry, who could they mourn for after someone had died, things like that. And it's not dissimilar for us as well, because we are a royal priesthood. We'll get into that verse here in a minute. But if someone knows then there might be an additional duty so that you don't present obstacles to other people, even if those things aren't necessarily sinful in and of themselves. They could lead someone astray or be an obstacle or stumbling block for someone else. And so as priests, we are called to that higher standard and to be spiritual leaders for those who are essentially older than in the faith, or who we might have spiritual authority over, et cetera, et cetera.
I think of a very practical one that Michael and I try to do. Well, it's more me because, but anyway, we don't keep alcohol in our house. And the reason is because we don't want to be a stumbling block for someone. If we try to invite people over from church all the time and try to keep people, coming to our house. And so if someone sees I have some beers in there and I enjoy a beer here and there, I don't think drinking in and of itself is wrong. God just says drunkenness is. But there are some who either they've had a problem with alcohol in the past, so they shouldn't be around it, or they, with their conscience, tells them that we should abstain from alcohol completely. And so I'd rather not take the chance of making someone stumble when they're at our house, and it sounds silly to some people. Now, granted, it's not like I love beer all the time and it's a huge sacrifice, but I do enjoy a good beer once in a while. And I'd rather not keep it in the house so that doesn't cause the issues comes over that could cause, and that's a very easy practice. But
because we are a brother's keeper, we are to watch out for the sin of our neighbor. So, So talking about that verse we had to just hit upon, 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who were once not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Again, I think we can kind of dissociate in the Christian mindset from priests. It's like, yeah, that's something like the Jews did or something else instead. No, we are called to be a priest as well. All Christians are called to be. As we talked about before, there's still pastoral leadership, and as we talked about with the Ark of the Covenant and whatnot, there's still leadership in how this goes about, but there's a community effort. Community effort doesn't negate leadership, and leadership doesn't negate community effort either. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The last thing, well, not quite the last thing, but one of the last few things we'll go through this is they set up the holy days, like feasts and things like that, for community celebration, for spiritual focus. It's for an individual walk with God and a communal faith shared.
So there's some that are, it's a little bit more inward focused. There's some that's like, this is a community celebration. And there's a variety of the different feasts that got prescribed. Some of them are, again, very joyous, and this is a good time for everyone. And some of them are, man, we done screwed up. This is the Day of Atonement. We're looking at our own sin and everything we have done wrong over this past year. It's just a good reminder that our faith isn't simply one or the other. It's not, well, I go to church to get a nice pep talk to feel happy and good about myself. No. Nor is it that I'm just going around beating myself all the time and that I'm just such a screwed up sinner. There's times for each of those. It's not always just one or the other, though. So,
again, the whole counsel of God.
Yep.
The counsel of God tells us we are scum-sucking sinners, but that he has chosen us and he delights in us nonetheless.
Yep.
And that salvation is there for us to take, for ourselves. That sounds weird to say it that way, but you know what I'm trying to say. And that, God wants us to follow him and do things and to really to prosper in some ways. Now, it's not the prosperity gospel of, and we're not promised to have everything we want in life.
Dang it.
But we will prosper spiritually.
Yes.
If we follow him and if as the Holy Spirit grows us more and more. So, yeah. So what we thought kind of epitomized Leviticus was Leviticus 10:3,
which is right after Aaron's sons have just been killed for offering the profane fire.
Yep. So then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord has said. So Aaron had kind of been like, well, why did God kill them? Like basically, which Aaron should have known better, but in his grief, we get a little bit of
losing children is hard.
Yeah. So this is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace.
God has standards for those who are called according to his name, for those who follow him. It's, as we talked about multiple times, it's not just about however we feel like it. He will be sanctified. He will be glorified in the manner that he deems pleasing to him.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts on, at this point, probably just Exodus and Leviticus, because I think we're running pretty well on time. So,
I mean, I think again, just engage with the scriptures, be in the word, be in fellowship. There's so much to God's word. Like we said, read it again, read it again, read it again, read it again. Always be in the word and reading more and more, because
are you dead yet? Read it again.
Yeah, exactly. But I think if you've read the Bible for very long, if you've been in the word and in the Lord for very long, it's amazing how you can have read a passage literally 100 times. The 101st time it has a new meaning to you. I'm not saying that there's multiple meanings to scripture, but God brings something to you that you're like, oh, wow.
It's like God reveals himself more and more to us as time goes on, kind of like he did from these books as well in the law. And we're not smart enough to get everything up front on our own. So
I'm not a smart man. I think that's just our encouragement is we went through all of this whole series, and now we're going into the books just to kind of encourage you to get in there. These are very high overviews. They definitely, you're not going to, hopefully you'll get something out of it, but it won't be all that you can get out.
And hopefully if you're in those books and reading, it's like, okay, what is this really going on about? Hopefully these overviews will give you at least some jumping off point to understand. So
absolutely. Yeah. So if you haven't yet, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, all those good things, let the YouTube overlords know that we're worth a view.
So all hail the algorithm. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been Discerning Faith. The Lord be with you and bless you.